Robert Moore taught us that the path to emotional healing begins when we dare to prioritize ourselves. In a world that constantly pushes us to look outward, to seek validation from others, and to mold ourselves to standards that aren't our own, we live in a culture that values image, performance, and immediate success, but rarely invites us to stop and reflect. What do I truly want? What do I need to feel whole? These answers aren't found in external opinions or imposed ideals, but in a deep connection with our true essence. Moore, in studying the archetypes of the mature masculine and the integrated inner feminine, pointed out that imbalance begins when we stray from the center. When we neglect our own psychic core, we become vulnerable to fragmentation, internal collapse, and emotional disconnection. When you choose to prioritize yourself, you're not being selfish. You're finally honoring the most important person in your life, yourself. Moore warned that many of our emotional wounds stem from a structural imbalance in our psyche. We spend years trying to fit into what society expects, what others desire, what culture applauds. We adopt postures, beliefs, and behaviors that aren't authentic, but necessary for symbolic survival. And in this continuous effort to be accepted, we disconnect from our central self. But here's the key. Everything you repress, everything you silence within yourself, doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes shadow. It becomes compulsive behavior, repetitive patterns, invisible sabotage. Moore explains that the shadow is the territory where archetypes distort, where the king becomes a tyrant or a weakling, where the warrior becomes destructive, where the lover gets lost in addiction, where the magician transforms into a manipulator. And if we don't approach these forces with consciousness and reverence, they inevitably explode into our daily lives. Perhaps you've noticed this in patterns that insist on repeating themselves. Relationships that drain your energy, decisions you make against your intuition, a constant feeling of living a life that isn't yours. We wonder why things don't change, why we're stuck in internal conflicts, without realizing that the solution isn't external, but in the integration of the rejected parts within us. Robert Moore invites us back to the origin, to sit with our fragmented aspects, to acknowledge the archetype of the king who wants to rule wisely, the warrior who desires to fight with honor, the lover who seeks true connection, and the magician who yearns for authentic transformation. When these parts are disintegrated, our life becomes a battlefield, but when they reintegrate, our energy aligns. Think of your life as a reflection of your psychic structure. If you're constantly surrounded by people who don't value you, if you feel drained in toxic relationships or situations that don't nourish your soul, it's no coincidence. It's your unconscious sending a call. There's something within you that needs to be reintegrated. The question is, are you ready to listen? Many avoid this process because it requires looking inward. It demands confronting the complexes we've developed, childhood wounds, unconscious traumas, and inherited patterns. But Moore is clear, true transformation happens when you go through the pain, not when you avoid it. When you understand that you can't heal while remaining in the same environment that sickened you, everything begins to change. This process isn't rational, it's symbolic. The psyche doesn't speak in logic, it speaks in images, myths, archetypes. And when you begin to prioritize yourself, your inner life gains a voice. What was hidden comes to the surface. Dreams change, intuitions intensify. Sensitivity returns, strength grows from within. Moore spoke of individuation not as an abstract concept, but as a rite of passage, a call for each human being to traverse the symbolic desert of the soul and return with new eyes, new values, a new inner order. And this doesn't mean abandoning the world, it means rather no longer depending on it to define your identity. How many times have you felt that your happiness depended on someone else's approval? How many times have you stopped following your own truth for fear of being rejected? Robert Moore said that when an archetype is distorted or absent, it seeks compensation, and in that symbolic void, we become hostages to emotional dependence, emotional deprivation, and the incessant search for external recognition. But when you begin to prioritize yourself, something changes within you. You begin to regain access to your inner throne, that symbolic place where the mature king or queen dwells. You no longer accept emotional crumbs. No longer delegate your integrity to others to fill your emptiness. This isn't because the world became more generous, but because you stopped begging for what should come from within. Emotional healing flows when there's inner sovereignty. And more was clear. A well-structured psyche is one where the four central archetypes cooperate. When the king connects with the magician, the warrior serves with purpose, and the lover loves deeply. But this is only possible when you consciously choose yourself, when you say yes to yourself. At this point, the relationships that drained you begin to lose their power. Situations that once imprisoned you cease to exert the same control, and not because the world changed, but because you changed how you position yourself. Transformation happens when you realize you're not here to sustain the unsustainable. Your environment needs to reflect your healing, not perpetuate your wounds. And this is a sensitive point for many. Leaving toxic environments requires courage. Setting firm boundaries demands strength. Choosing your own well-being requires an act of faith in yourself. Robert Moore reminded us that this faith is built when we connect with our sacred core, that point of inner quietude, where our divine spark resides, where the soul touches the eternal. You need to learn to say no. You need to learn to set boundaries. You need to learn to listen to yourself. How many times have you ignored your intuition for fear of disappointing someone? How many times have you sacrificed your peace to maintain an image of stability? Moore warns us that the price of living disconnected from your center is high. We pay with anxiety, anguish, empty relationships, and a life that doesn't feel like our own. But when you decide to prioritize yourself, you begin to notice something surprising. The world no longer seems so chaotic. Relationships no longer feel like silent wars. Why? Because you stopped warring against yourself. When internal conflicts cease, the external reorganizes. Balance doesn't come from outside, but from a restored inner order. Moore saw the process of psychic maturation as an initiatory path, a rite of passage that everyone sooner or later is called to walk. And this path isn't linear. There are losses, there are dark nights, there are moments when everything crumbles so that the new can emerge. But in every collapse, there's also the opportunity for rebirth. Individuation, according to Moore, requires us to abandon inherited molds, the invisible scripts of family, culture, and authority figures. It demands that we recognize what is ours and what is not, that we stop carrying burdens that don't belong to us, that we stop repeating stories that have already run their course. And when this happens, you begin to see clearly. You realize that certain relationships only existed because you were the one sustaining everything, that in many situations you gave more than you received, that often you tolerated the intolerable just to avoid being alone. But the moment you choose yourself is also the moment something within you breaks, and this rupture, though painful, is necessary. It's through this crack that the light of consciousness enters. It's in this moment that you begin to truly see yourself. Moore taught that everything we repress finds a way to manifest. If we don't listen to our needs, we project them onto others. If we don't recognize our worth, we attract people who treat us with indifference. If we avoid our wounds, the world takes charge of showing us mirrors that continuously reopen them. And that's why most people avoid this work. Because it's not comfortable. Because it means accepting that what we called love was often attachment. That what we called friendship was convenience. That the decisions we made most of the time were driven by the fear of not being enough. But when you prioritize yourself, you stop conforming. You stop negotiating with your truth. You stop sustaining what should have already been released. And then something inevitable happens. You begin to lose people, but not because you changed, but because you stopped tolerating what you once accepted. Some people will distance themselves. Some won't even say why. Others will try to make you feel guilty for no longer being the person they knew. This is frightening. This is hurtful. But Moore reminds us that losing those who are no longer aligned with your evolution is not a failure. It's a liberation. For every door that closes, a space opens for something more authentic. And although this process is profoundly necessary, it's never easy. The unconscious resists change. It wants predictability. It wants familiarity, even if the familiar is painful. Moore explains that the archetype of the warrior needs to be activated at this moment, not to fight against others, but to resist the call to return to the old, to what no longer serves. The warrior's courage is the force that keeps you on the walk away when the most fragile part of you wants to give up. Many people stay in relationships that hurt them because the fear of the unknown seems greater than the suffering they already know. But it's precisely at this point that true transformation sets in, when you dare to let go. Letting go isn't forgetting, it's not pretending it didn't hurt. Letting go is accepting that we can't force anyone to value us, that we can't force anyone to stay, that the only true responsibility we have is to our own well-being. It's at this moment that your soul begins to reorganize itself, and you realize there are only two types of people: those who continue to seek outside what they can only find within, and those who finally begin their journey back to themselves. Robert Moore said the path to wholeness is challenging, but it's the only one worth taking. It's the path of authenticity, of internal recognition, of living aligned with your essence, without apologies, without disguises, without needing to convince anyone. And something powerful begins to happen when you choose yourself. Your relationships change. People who were in your life only out of convenience or interest drift away. And in their place, people who truly see who you are begin to arrive, who value your presence, who walk beside you without demanding that you diminish yourself. These are relationships based on reciprocity, where affection isn't a power game, but a space of mutual support, where care doesn't demand constant sacrifice but is nurtured by respect. When you begin to value yourself, you stop accepting less than you deserve. However, most people don't reach this point, because the process of letting go is painful, and not just because of the loss itself, but because it forces us to confront a difficult truth, that we allowed certain dynamics to persist for too long. It's easier to blame the other person, to say the problem is outside, but Moore warns us, the external world is always a reflection of our internal world. And until we are able to heal our deepest wounds, we will continue repeating the same cycles. This is where the concept of the shadow comes in. Moore spoke clearly about this. The shadow isn't an enemy. It's a forgotten, rejected, exiled part of ourselves. It's our fears, hidden desires, emotional wounds, denied instincts. Denying the shadow doesn't eliminate it. It only gives it more power over us. The shadow hides in the relationships we choose, in the conflicts we attract, in the emotions we can't control. When you begin to prioritize yourself, you begin a process of making the shadow conscious. You begin to notice your own patterns, the times you say yes when you mean no, the places where you abandon yourself to be accepted. And at this point you have two choices: continue on autopilot, living from unconsciousness, or begin to take control of your own story. This is the point where many retreat, because confronting the shadow is uncomfortable. It means admitting that we allowed situations that hurt us, that we gave too much where we weren't valued, that we tolerated the minimum when we deserved the maximum. But here's the truth: the pain of facing reality is temporary. The pain of living in denial lasts a lifetime. Moore invites us to look at ourselves with honesty, but also with compassion, because there is no healing without recognition, and there is no transformation without acceptance. The moment you decide to stop running away and begin to face yourself truthfully, something within you changes. You stop searching for culprits, you stop outsourcing your responsibility, and you finally begin to assume your power, to understand that life doesn't happen against you but from you, to realize that you don't need anyone's approval to live an authentic existence. It is from this point that true transformation becomes inevitable, because when you change your consciousness, everything around you begins to reorganize itself in harmony with this new inner frequency. You begin to attract situations and people who are in tune with your new level of awareness. You stop striving to fit into places that always demanded your diminishment. Anxiety about the future begins to disappear, because now you trust your ability to walk with integrity. Relationships become spaces of mutual growth and no longer arenas of unconscious conflict. And most importantly, you regain your power. This doesn't mean everything will be perfect or that you will never feel fear or insecurity again, but it means that now you have the tools to no longer be dominated by these emotions. You no longer act from lack, but from wholeness. You no longer desperately seek love, because you recognize that true love begins within you. Moore taught us that the purpose of the human journey is not to avoid pain, but to integrate it. That true maturity comes not from fleeing wounds, but from a willingness to walk alongside them until they transform into wisdom. When you allow yourself to live this, you stop running from the past, stop worrying about what hasn't happened yet, and begin to fully live the only time that truly exists. The now. This is where peace reveals itself. Not as an absence of conflict, but as the ability to sustain your truth no matter what happens. This peace doesn't come from the opinions of others, but from the inner certainty that you are enough as you are. This is the gift of choosing yourself. You not only regain your energy, your time, and your clarity, you regain your authenticity. And when you choose to live according to your truth, something even more beautiful happens. Life begins to become a reflection of your inner world. Things that once seemed confusing become clearer. Situations you tolerated without question begin to feel too heavy. And this is no coincidence. It's a sign of growth. It's your soul telling you that you can no longer ignore what you've avoided for so long. Robert Moore reminded us that consciousness isn't static. It expands as we are willing to delve deeper into ourselves. And when this happens, the external world cannot remain the same. Because what you see outside will always be a mirror of what you carry inside. If there is clarity within you, there will be clarity without. If there is chaos within, chaos will also be reflected in your experiences. That's why, by prioritizing yourself, you begin to attract situations and people in harmony with your new vibration. You no longer need to force connections. You no longer need to beg for affection. You no longer need to prove anything to anyone. Things begin to flow naturally because you are no longer operating from scarcity, but from abundance. This transition doesn't happen overnight. There will be moments when you doubt, moments when the temptation to return to what is familiar will be great. There will be loneliness. There will be silences. But these moments are tests of the unconscious. Not because the universe wants to punish you, but because you need to demonstrate to yourself that you are ready for the next level. And it is precisely when you begin to prioritize yourself that old patterns and people from the past tend to reappear. Situations that once paralyzed you return to see if you still react as before. This is not a setback, it's an opportunity. An opportunity to reaffirm your new identity, to choose differently, to act from your higher self. When you pass this test, something extraordinary happens. Your energy changes completely. You are no longer bound by the need to please. You no longer need to justify your decisions. You no longer expect others to validate your path. You have become sovereign over yourself. And it is at this point that the world begins to respond. New possibilities emerge. People who once seemed unreachable draw closer. What once seemed impossible begins to manifest. Not because the world has changed, but because you have become receptive to what has always been available, but could only be accessed when you were ready. At this stage, many say, "Now I've woken up." And indeed, you have woken up. You realize that all the pain, all the loss, all the falls had a purpose, to bring you here. And although it's not easy to revisit the past, you look at it with new eyes. You understand that every rejection was, in fact, a liberation. That every collapse made room for reconstruction. That every silence brought the chance to hear your own soul more clearly. Moore said that the unconscious doesn't forget, but it can heal. Memories remain, but the relationship we have with them changes. Wounds cease to be chains that imprison us and become sacred scars, living proof of how much you have grown. And when you stop seeing your history as a series of failures and begin to see it as a journey of evolution, everything changes. The problem is that many people never reach this point. They remain trapped in resentment, nostalgia, guilt. They continue to look back, wishing things had been different. But true power doesn't lie in what could have been. It lies in what you choose to do with what you have now. When you prioritize yourself, you stop living in the past. You no longer need to justify what happened. You no longer need to lament what was lost. You simply accept that everything unfolded in the way it needed to so that you could become who you are today. And this is where life begins to become truly fascinating. Because when you free yourself from the weight of what was, you discover that the future is entirely in your hands, that there is no rigid destiny to which you are chained, but infinite possibilities awaiting your conscious decision. The only question that remains is, what will you do with this new freedom? Will you continue repeating old patterns for fear of making mistakes again? Or will you dare to write something completely new? Most choose the safe, the familiar. They prefer to cling to the predictable even if it means sacrificing true joy. But those who truly prioritize themselves, who decide to live from their essence, even if it means losing what was comfortable, discover that life has so much more to offer than they ever imagined. Because when you choose yourself, the world begins to choose you too. When you value yourself, life responds by giving you more reasons to continue. When you let go of what doesn't serve you, what is truly yours finds a way to reach you. This isn't magic. It's not luck. It's the natural law of energy. It's the reflection of your new inner landscape. It's the inevitable result of making the most important decision of your life, the decision to be true to yourself. When you finally decide to prioritize yourself, life takes a completely different course. You no longer cling to what hurts you. You no longer try to convince anyone to love you. You no longer live in the uncertainty of whether or not you deserve to be who you are. Because deep down you know you are enough. You stop searching outside for what has always been within. But that doesn't mean the path will always be easy. There will be days when you doubt yourself, when echoes of the past try to speak louder, moments when the old seems more comfortable than the new, but the difference now is that you know, you remember, you've learned, your peace is priceless, your well-being is non-negotiable, your worth doesn't depend on anyone's opinion, and that changes everything. Moore taught us that the purpose of life is not superficial happiness, but real fulfillment. And fulfillment is only achieved when we allow ourselves to be who we are, with everything that entails, without masks, without shame, without seeking approval. It's living from authenticity. It's embracing our lights and our shadows. It's understanding that every experience, however difficult, has been part of building our being. When you reach this point, you no longer want to please, you want genuine connection. You no longer seek to fit in, you desire to belong. And belonging is only possible when you can be completely yourself. That's where the real magic happens. Because when you live from your truth, you begin to attract exactly what resonates with it. Opportunities appear, connections bloom, spaces open up. Not because you sought them, but because you became the kind of person who naturally manifests what they desire. And that's why this message doesn't end here. If this reflection touched something within you, if at any point you felt these words spoke directly to your soul, understand, this is no accident. This knowledge isn't just for you. It also serves other people, thousands of them, who are exactly where you once were, lost, tired, silent, waiting for a sign to change. Sharing this message is more than an act of generosity. It's a gesture of collective healing. If you've ever felt alone in this process, remember that you are not. There's a silent army of people awakening to their truth, deciding to break patterns, choosing their own well-being above all else. And every word you share could be the spark someone was waiting for to begin their transformation. So, tell me in the comments, what part of this message touched something within you? What are you willing to change? What relationships or habits have you decided to let go of? Or just tell me how you feel after hearing all this. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Every time you interact with this content, you help this message reach more people and become an active part of a movement of consciousness, healing, and transformation. The world needs more people who have the courage to live their truth, who choose authenticity even in the face of fear, who prioritize peace over chaos, who know that taking care of themselves is not selfishness, it's the foundation of everything. If this message reached you, it's because you're ready to let go of what no longer makes sense, ready to make space for the new, ready to live a life with real meaning. It won't be easy, but I promise you, it will be worth it. Because when you prioritize yourself, emotional healing flows without barriers. And life finally becomes what it was always meant to be, a reflection of your own truth. See you in the next video. Until then, keep choosing yourself, one time after another.